Hello, everybody. We're going to continue our readings in Neal Stephenson's In the Beginning Was the Command Line. This will be part 4. But before I begin reading, I'd like to make a comment about part 3 that I forgot to mention in my commentary. In one of the chapters or pages in part 3, Neal Stephenson talks about how GUI interfaces had already been attached to mobile phones. And I just wanted to comment on this because as a guy who's like almost 50 as I record this, having lived through that era, I find his comments very amazing. I got a picture here I'm going to put up. This is from a Nokia 8210. This is from 1999. Now, this is very indicative of the phones of that era. For people who don't know, maybe a younger generation, phones back then were actually really tiny, really small little things. They would easily fit into the palm of your hand. And what you would do is you'd either had a flip phone, like later on a few years ago, a Motorola Razor, like I would end up getting, which was incidentally my first, I believe it was a Razor, was my first cell phone. Got it in 2004. These things were actually small compared to your typical mobile phone now, which is just, it's going on the edge of being a brick again. Of course, we know why, because it's a full-fledged computer versus just a phone with a few simple apps, if you will. But anyway, I just wanted to comment on that. I just find it striking, his commentary. Again, this book was written in 1999, and thinking about the phones of the 90s versus the phones of the 2022s as I record this, it just makes me stop and think, have a little trip down nostalgia, and think about how things have progressed. So, with that in mind, though, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so we're in our next chapter, which is Metaphor Shear. I began using Windows Word as soon as the first version was released around 1985. After some initial hassles, I found it to be a better tool than its competition. I wrote a lot of stuff in early versions of Word, storing it all on floppies, and transferred the contents of all my floppies to my first hard drive, which I acquired around 1987. As new versions of Word came out, I faithfully upgraded. Reasoned that as a writer, it made sense for me to spend a certain amount of money on tools. Sometime in the mid-1990s, I attempted to open one of my old Circa 1985 Word documents using the version of Word, then current 6.0. It didn't work. Word 6.0 did not recognize a document created by an earlier version of itself. By opening it as a text file, I was able to recover the sequences of letters that made up the text of the document. My words were still there, but the formatting had been run through a log chipper. The words I had written were interpreted by spades of empty rectangular boxes and gibberish. Now, in the context of a business, the chief market for Word, this sort of thing is only an annoyance, one of the routine hassles that go along with using computers. It's easy to buy little file converter programs that will take care of this problem. But if you're a writer whose career is words, whose professional identity is a corpus of written documents, this kind of thing is extremely disquieting. There are very few fixed assumptions in my line of work, but one of them is that once you have written a word, it is written and cannot be unwritten. The ink stains the paper, the chisel cuts the stone, the stylus marks the clay, and something has irrevocably happened. My brother-in-law is a theologian who reads 3,250-year-old cuneiform tablets. He can recognize the handwriting of particular scribes and identify them by name. But word processing software, particularly the sort that employs special, complex file formats, has the eldritch power to unwrite things. A small change in file formats for a few twiddled bits in months or years, literary output can be ceased to exist. Now, this was technically a fault in the application. Word 6.0 for the Macintosh, not the operating system. Mac OS, something. And so the initial target of my annoyance was the people who were responsible for Word. But on the other hand, I could have chosen the Save as Text option in Word and saved all of my documents as simple telegrams, and this problem would not have arisen. Instead, I had allowed myself to be seduced by all of those flashy formatting options that hadn't even existed until GUIs had come along to make them practicable. I had gotten into the habit of using them to make my documents look pretty, perhaps prettier than they deserved to look. All of the old documents on those floppies turned out to be more or less crap. Now, I was paying the price for all that self-indulgence. Technology had moved on and found ways to make my documents look even prettier, and the consequence of it was that all old ugly documents had ceased to exist. It was, if you'll pardon me for a moment's strange little fantasy, as if I'd gone to stay at some resort, some exquisitely designed and art-directed hotel, placing myself in the hands of past masters of the sensorial interface. I had sat down in my room and written a story in ballpoint pen on a yellow legal pad, and when I returned from dinner, discovered that the maid had taken my work away and left behind in its place a quill pen and a stack of fine parchment, explaining that the room looked ever so much finer this way, and it was all part of a routine upgrade. But written on these sheets of paper in flawless penmanship were long sequences of words chosen at random from the dictionary. Appalling, sure, but I couldn't really lodge a complaint with the management because, by staying at this resort, I had given my consent to it. I had surrendered my Morlock credentials and become an Eloy. Yeah, I just want to, we're at the end of this chapter, which is a short chapter, and we're going to read on. But I just want to make some comments. He talks about Word in 1985. Yeah, here's something that young people may not realize or not remember or whatever. Back in the 80s, to get a word processor, and this goes up well into the 90s too, you had to buy the box set. It was literally a floppy disk, and I have a picture on there of a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk. And you had to insert it and load it. And then when the upgrade came, say like with Microsoft, maybe 6 months later, a year, you didn't download it. That wouldn't be until like the early 2000s, maybe late 90s. No, instead you had to go out and buy another box set for these incremental upgrades. And if you're using Microsoft, anybody who uses Microsoft knows, Microsoft products are notoriously buggy. Bill Gates' philosophy was just good enough to make a sale. He didn't have the passion for perfection like Steve Jobs did. So don't be surprised if you had to buy multiple upgrades, if you had multiple problems. Maybe you could contact Microsoft or another vendor from that era and get like a disk to get an upgrade. I had that happen once or twice back in the 80s. So, it's just really strange. And also for younger people who don't realize this, I got a 5 1/4 inch disc on picture here. Now, keep in mind, the bigger the disc, the less it stores. It's just the way technology was. When I was a real little kid, and in the early 80s, I saw some relics of that era, like some 8-inch discs, and those only held about half as much information, 5 1/4. Then a little bit later, in the late 80s, we started, later part, maybe around 87-ish, I remember, we started getting the 3.5 inch, which held more data than those 5 1/4. Then we started moving to CD-ROMs, USB drives, etc. Right now, as I record this, the USB thumbstick is probably the most smallest, easy to use, high storage capacity item out there, and it's cheap. It's like $10 for 32 gigabytes at my local store. Reasonable price. All right, let's continue. It was, in other words, a glass teletype running a command line interface, and came with all sorts of cryptic but powerful commands, which could be invoked by typing their names, which I learned to use only gradually. It was not until a few years later, when I began messing around with Unix, that I understood that the command line interface, the first thing that Apple's hackers had done when they gotten the Mac OS up and running, probably even before they gotten it up and running, was to recreate the Unix interface so that they would be able to get some useful work done. At the time, I simply couldn't get my mind around this. But apparently, as far as Apple's hackers were concerned, the Mac's vaunted graphical user interface was an impediment, something to be circumvented before the little toaster even came out onto the market. Even before my PowerBook crashed and obliterated my big file in July 1995, there had been danger signs. An old college buddy of mine, who starts and runs high-tech companies in Boston, had developed a commercial product using Macintoshes as the front end. Basically, the Macs were high-performance graphics terminals. chosen for their sweet user interface, giving users access to a large database of graphical information stored on a network of much more powerful but less user-friendly computers. This fellow was the second person who turned me onto Macintoshes, by the way, and through the mid-1980s, we had shared the thrill of being high-tech cognoscenti using superior Apple technology in a world of DOS-using knuckleheads. Early versions of my friend's system had worked well, he told me, but when several machines joined the network, mysterious crashes began to occur. Sometimes the whole network would just freeze. It was one of those bugs that could not be reproduced easily. Finally, they figured out that these network crashes were triggered whenever a user, scanning the menus for a particular item, held down the mouse button for more than a couple of seconds. Fundamentally, the Mac OS could do only one thing at a time. Drawing a menu on the screen is one thing. So when a menu was pulled down, the Macintosh was not capable of doing anything else until the indecisive user released the button. This is not such a bad thing in a single user, single process machine, although it's a fairly bad thing. But it's no good in a machine that is on a network, because being on a network implies some kind of continual low-level interaction with other machines. By failing to respond to the network, the Mac caused a network-wide crash. In order to work with other computers and with networks and with various different types of hardware, an OS must be incomparably more complicated and powerful than either MS-DOS or the original Mac OS. The only way of connecting to the internet that's worth taking seriously is PPP, the point-to-point protocol, which, never mind the details, makes your computer temporarily a full-fledged member of the global internet with its own unique address and various privileges, powers, and responsibilities appertaining thereunto. Technically, it means your machine is running the TCP/IP protocol, which, to make a long story short, revolves around sending packets of data back and forth in no particular order and at unpredictable times according to a clever and elegant set of rules. But sending a packet of data is one thing, and so an OS that can only do one thing at a time cannot simultaneously be part of the internet and do anything else. When TCP/IP was invented, running it was an honor reserved for serious computers, mainframes, and high-powered mini-computers used in technical and commercial settings. And so the protocol is engineered around the assumption that every computer using it is a serious machine, capable of doing many things at once. Not to put too fine a point on it, a Unix machine, neither Mac OS nor MS-DOS, was originally built with that in mind. And so when the internet got hot, radical changes had to be made. When my PowerBook broke my heart, and when Word stopped recognizing my old files, I jumped to Unix. The obvious alternative to Mac OS would have been Windows. I didn't really have anything against Windows, or against Microsoft, or Windows. But it was pretty obvious now that old PC operating systems were overreaching and showing the strain, and perhaps were best avoided until they had learned to walk and chew gum at the same time. The changeover took place on a particular day in the summer of 1995. I had been in San Francisco for a couple of weeks using my PowerBook to work on a document. The document was too big to fit onto a single floppy, and so I hadn't made a backup since leaving home. The PowerBook crashed and wiped out the entire file. It happened just as I was on my way out the door to visit a company called Electric Communities, which in those days was in Los Altos. I took my PowerBook with me. My friends at Electric Communities were Mac users who had all sorts of utility software for unerasing files and recovering from disk crashes, and I was certain I would get most of the file back. As it turned out, two different Mac crash recovery utilities were unable to find any trace that my file had ever existed. It was completely and systematically wiped out. We went through the hard disk block by block and found disjointed fragments of countless old, discarded, forgotten files, but none of what I wanted. The metaphor Shear was especially brutal that day. It was the sort of like watching the girl you've been in love with for 10 years get killed in a car wreck, then attending her autopsy and learning that underneath the clothes and makeup, she was just flesh and blood. I must have been reeling around the offices of the electric communities in some kind of primal Jungian fugue, because at this moment three weirdly synchronistic things happened. Number one, Randy Farmer, a co-founder of the company, came in for a quick visit along with his family. He was recovering from back surgery at the time. He had some hot gossip. Windows 95 mastered today. What this meant was that Microsoft's new operating system had on this day been placed on a special compact disc known as a Golden Master, which would be used to stamp out a gentillion copies in preparation for its thunderous release a few weeks later. This news was received peevishly by the staff of the electric communities, including one whose office door was plastered with the usual assortment of cartoons and novelties. Number two, a copy of Dilbert cartoon in which Dilbert, the long-suffering corporate software engineer, encourages a portly, bearded, hairy man of a certain age, a bit like Santa Claus, but darker, with a certain edge about him. Dilbert recognizes this man based upon his appearance and effect as a Unix hacker, and reacts with a certain mixture of nervousness, awe, and hostility. Dilbert jabs weakly at the disturbing interloper for a couple of frames. The Unix hacker listens with a kind of infuriate, beatific calm. Then, in the last frame, reaches into his pocket. "Here's a nickel, kid," he says. "Go buy yourself a real computer." 3. The owner of the door and the cartoon was one Doug Barnes. Barnes was known to harbor certain heretical opinions on the subject of operating systems, unlike most Bay Area techies who revered the Macintosh, considering it to be a true hacker's machine. Barnes was fond of pointing out that the Mac, with its hermetically sealed architecture, was actually hostile to hackers, who are prone to tinkering and dogmatic about openness. By contrast, the IBM-compatible line of machines, which can easily be taken apart and plugged back together, was much more hackable. So when I got home, I began messing around with Linux, which is one of many, many different concrete implementations of the abstract Platonic idea called Unix. I was not looking forward to changing over to a new OS, because my credit cards were still smoking from all the money I'd spent on Mac hardware over the years. But Linux's great virtue was, and is, that it would run on exactly the same sort of hardware as the Microsoft OS's, which is to say the cheapest hardware in existence. And if to demonstrate why this was a great idea, I was, within a week or two of returning home, able to get my hands on then decent computer, a 33 megahertz 486 box for free, because I knew a guy who worked in an office where they were simply being thrown away. Once I got it home, I yanked the hood off, stuck my hands in, and began switching cards around. If something didn't work, I went to a used computer outlet and pawned through a bin full of components and bought a new card for a few bucks. The availability of all this cheap but effective hardware was an unintended consequence of decisions that had been made more than a decade earlier by IBM and Microsoft. When Windows came out and brought the GUI to a much larger market, the hardware regimen changed. The cost of color video cards and high-resolution monitors began to drop, and is dropping still. The free-for-all approach to hardware meant that Windows was unavoidably clunky compared to Mac OS, but the GUI brought computing to such a vast audience that volume went way up and prices collapsed. Meanwhile, Apple, which so badly wanted a clean integrated OS with video neatly integrated into process and hardware, had fallen far behind in market share, at least partly because their beautiful hardware cost so much. But the price that we Mac owners had to pay for superior aesthetics and engineering was not merely a financial one. There was a cultural price too, stemming from the fact that we couldn't open up the hood and mess around with it. Doug Barnes was right. Apple, in spite of its reputation as the machine of choice of scruffy, creative hacker types, had actually created a machine that discouraged hacking, while Microsoft, viewed as a technological laggard and copycat, had created a vast, disorderly parts bazaar, a primordial soup that eventually self-assembled into Linux. Alright, that's all the reading I want to do for tonight. Again, we're at the end of the chapter, so I'd like to make some commentary. All right. So the 80s, the 90s, it's a mix of the good and the bad. At the very beginning of our reading, what the bad part was, like whenever you wanted to upgrade your software, you had to go get a physical floppy disk and upgrade from there, and that could be expensive, difficult, etc. Oh, and the box, and you had to buy a box set too. But that was the good old days too. There's a certain fondness I have of having physical media, a certain appreciation I still have today. But Neal Strauss here, or not Neal Strauss, Neal Stephenson. He's talking about like these MacBooks, and it's just, he talks about how closed they are compared to Windows, and there's a lot of truth to that. My first experience with Apple was with high school at my local university. I was a high school kid, but we had a nearby university, so my friends and I would go there, and through these new friends of mine, I met these college kids. Because I'm a high school kid, they're college kids. And I learned how to play NetTrek, which was a bunch of Macintosh computers connected together. And they had a local area network, or LAN. And you played Star Trek, like Klingon versus Federation, your little ship flying around just blowing each other up. It was a very primitive game by today's standards, but fun back then. But the thing was, man, now the Macs were really cool looking. I loved how simple they were. I mean, they were elegant. They were small, compact, but they were only black and white too. Now you had a Windows computer back then. Your Windows machine was a big clunky box. It was big, ugly, and heavy, but you could open it up. You could change out the graphics card. You could swap components within their computer. There was something to really be said about that. Now my next computer, and this is when I started getting into Mac myself, it was in 2007 when I bought the white polycarbonate MacBook. Yeah, I was going to buy actually a Dell 13-inch XP with Windows Vista. Yay. But thankfully, there was a delay in the production and shipment of that, so I halted that order. And through some English teaching friends I met here in Korea, I ended up purchasing one of the white MacBook. And man, I love that thing. It was sweet. I still has a fond little place in my heart. Obviously, 15 years ago, it's out of date. The only reason I got rid of it was getting old, and one of my cousins, through my wife, needed the computer, so I donated it to him. But oh yeah, great fond memories. And there's a certain thing about nostalgia. Some of the things back in the past, it's not just there were really good machines. I mean, obviously they're dated today and all, but they were really good machines. All right, so another thing to talk about. He's talking about he makes a comment about the TCP, or Transmission Control Protocol /IP, which is Internet Protocol, which is for your internet address. And it's just funny because this is the 1990s, right? So everything he's talking about is bleeding edge, cutting edge, but a lot of that stuff today, like TCP, has been updated. Your IP, the latest version of IP is now IPv6. IPv4 is still around, still using legacy systems. In fact, if you were to go online right now and type "what is my IP," you would get your IPv4 and IPv6. In case you didn't know that, you can look that up for yourself, or find it in your computer if you know where to look in your settings. But anyway, finally, I just want to talk about the Linux. All right, so. Or Unix, as he talks about. He talks about Unix a lot, and it's real funny because nowadays I don't hear Unix being used. Do you hear about Unix being used? Probably not. Not unless you're deliberately talking about it. And there's a good reason. I don't think anybody uses it. My first experience with Unix was in 2005. I went back to college to get some additional schooling after I graduated because I wanted to, one, out of curiosity because I like computers. Two, was to make myself marketable and maybe explore going into the IT field. So at that time, I was just dabbling with it. And that's when I learned how to use Unix. And I just want to say, I did not enjoy using Unix. Linux is okay. Unix was not fun. This was the first OS, okay? So just keep in mind, it didn't even have a delete button. So try editing and deleting, think about today. Delete key is so commonplace, you can't imagine not having it. But you didn't have it. Why? Because back in the 1960s when Unix was developed, it didn't exist. But towards the end of the class, maybe 3/4 of the way through, we were introduced to something special called Linux. It was in our science lab, or like an additional computer. We had our classroom, but we had to go to a special computer lab. in order to go see Linux. There in a blue screen with yellow text with a little yellow penguin was Linux, and that was our first experience with it. And of course, it was a GUI. Same time Ubuntu was coming out, which is real funny because at the time, again, the internet, it wasn't new, but you didn't have all the high-speed download, uploads, and stuff that you do today. So it was still popular to send out physical discs to people who were interested, just like AOL used to do. So I used to have a bunch of these Ubuntu discs and stuff, so my buddy, and just good times, good introductions to this stuff. All right, that's all for now. Enough rambling. Thank you all for listening to this, and be on the lookout for the next episode. Bye.